My words shall carry the echo of the gales that whisper through the canyon of winter winds, and the resonance of our people's sacred fire. This is the saga of the Quiet Water people, of a time when the earth beneath our feet trembled with the tread of a new, hitherto unknown world, and the shadow of uncertainty began to creep slowly over our days. The autumn encampment of the Quiet Water people nestled snugly in a gentle bend of the river, where ancient willows, witnesses to many changing seasons, humbly bowed their long, supple branches to the water's very edge, their leaves already touched by the first gold of autumn's decline. Smoke from numerous hearths, carefully tended within wigwams constructed of sturdy, smoothly hewn poles, and covered with thick, well-cured bison hides, trailed in thin, almost invisible tendrils toward the high sky. This sky today wore the color of sere leaves, mingled with the cool azure of approaching frosts, creating a sense of peace and a gentle melancholy. Singing River, a woman whose movements echoed the gentle flow of the water that gave her name, and wife to Swift Deer, the tribe's finest hunter, diligently sorted the last gifts bestowed by a bounteous Mother Earth, alongside the other women of the community. Their fingers, accustomed to such work, deftly separated tart, bright red cranberries, gathered from the nearby sprawling marshes, from tiny twigs and leaves. Beside them lay sweet, nourishing camas roots, their bluish tubers promising sustenance through the long winter months, and bunches of wild onions, whose pungent aroma pleasantly tickled the nostrils. The women sat on hides spread upon the earth, their backs straight, their faces focused. Their calloused fingers, with astonishing speed and precision, wove capacious baskets from pliant willow withes, freshly cut from the riverside. These baskets were essential for carrying and storing provisions. On wooden frames set a little apart, fresh deer hides were stretched taut. Several women, armed with stone scrapers worn to sharp edges, diligently cleaned them of fat and flesh, preparing the material for warm winter clothing and lodge coverings. The monotonous scraping sound mingled with quiet conversations and occasional soft singing. The air above the entire encampment was thickly permeated with a complex yet familiar and pleasant bouquet of scents. There was the aroma of jerky drying on special racks, the tart smell of smoke from slowly smoldering juniper bark used for curing, and the subtle notes of dried medicinal herbs gathered by wise owl. All these scents wove into a single symphony, occasionally joined by the bright, carefree laughter of children. Boys and girls, free from serious tasks, played an enthusiastic game of gopher hunt at the very edge of the forest, their shouts and scuffles enlivening the tranquil autumn day. As evening approached, when the sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in crimson and orange hues, the hunters returned from the prairies. Swift Deer, the ever-silent and observant Silent Wolf, and Stone Fist, renowned for his strength. Their few, yet hardy and strong horses, acquired several seasons ago in trade with tribes dwelling far to the south, trod wearily, their heads bowed. Considerably less game than everyone had expected and hoped for was secured to the animals' backs. The great innumerable herds of bison, which for generations had fed the Quiet Water people, providing them with meat, hides, and bones for tools, were moving farther and farther west. They were driven from their traditional pastures by a previously unknown thunder, the thunder of fire sticks wielded by pale-skinned men, who came from the east and brought destruction with them. When twilight fully enveloped the encampment and the first stars ignited in the sky, the entire tribe gathered around the main, largest fire. Strong Hand, the tribe's chief, his face a roadmap of deep wrinkles, each holding memories of years lived, joys and sorrows, rose. His voice, when he spoke, was deep and calm, like the slow current of a great river beneath winter ice. My children, listen to me. The time of yellow leaves, the time of autumn's bounty, is drawing to a close. The spirits of harsh winter are already near. Their cold breath we feel upon our backs. It is time to prepare for the journey, to go to our wintering grounds at Blue Lake. There, among the high cliffs, we will find shelter from the piercing winds, and the forest will give us warmth for our hearths and food. Wise Owl, the tribe's eldest shaman, whose eyes saw not only what was visible to ordinary sight, but also the shadows of the past and the portents of the future, sat silently by the fire, observing the whimsical dance of the flames. He slowly took a pinch of sacred tobacco and a little dry, bitter wormwood from his leather pouch, tossed them into the heart of the fire, and gazed intently at the curling patterns of the rising smoke, reading in them a hidden message. The owls cry unnervingly this year. This autumn is troubled, he murmured, almost in a whisper, addressing Strong Hand so that only the chief could hear. And the wolves, our old neighbors, now shun our trails. They have scented something more dreadful there than man with his bow and spear. The great serpent, who sleeps deep within the earth and guards its secrets, tosses restlessly in his slumber. I feel it. Something very dark, a bringer of misfortune, moves from the east, from where the pale-faced newcomer's sick, dim sun rises each day. It is not merely the shadow of themselves, of their presence on our land. It is the shadow of what they have awakened by their actions, the shadow of a being they have driven from its own lands, which now seeks a new haven. The men, having listened to the chief and the shaman, silently began preparations for the long and perilous journey. Swift Deer meticulously checked the tension of his powerful bowstring, fashioned from the sturdy horn of a mountain ram. He went through his arrows one by one, inspecting the fletching and the sharp points of obsidian and flint, which he himself had patiently and skillfully shaped during long autumn evenings by the fire. Stone Fist carefully examined his heavy war club with its massive stone head, a weapon requiring great strength. Strong Hand, the chief, possessed an old flintlock rifle, a gift from a French trader many winters ago, but there was only enough powder left for a few shots, and each bullet was worth its weight in gold, so the rifle was saved for the direst need. The women, meanwhile, were not idle. They mended worn-out moccasins of soft yet durable elk hide, and stuffed leather parfleche bags with dried meat and pemmican, pounded berries mixed with fat, a nourishing food that would sustain the entire tribe on their long trek through the cold lands. Just before their departure, as the first rays of sunlight merely caressed the treetops, Wise Owl conducted a sacred ritual of farewell to the spirits of the summer encampment. In the center of a large circle formed by all members of the tribe, he kindled a small, special fire, using only dry twigs from sacred trees. He raised his hands to the sky and addressed the spirits of the four winds, Mother Earth who had given them food and shelter, and the spirit of the river who had quenched their thirst and that of their animals, thanking them for their generosity and asking for protection and blessings on the journey ahead. Then he lit his long peace pipe, filled with a mixture of tobacco and herbs, and released the first puff of smoke first to the sky, to the Great Spirit, then to the earth, paying homage to the nurturing mother, and then in turn to the four cardinal directions. The warriors preparing for the trek washed their faces and hands in the cool river water and then applied sacred symbols of their guardian spirits to their skin: the swift eagle, the strong bear, the cunning wolf, using black and red clay mixed with water. Singing River, without a word but with great tenderness in her gaze, silently wove a small but bright hawk feather into Swift-Ear's long black hair, a symbol of keen eyesight and quick, precise reaction, qualities so essential for a hunter and warrior. On the last night spent at the summer encampment, when all preparations were complete and belongings packed, the elders gathered around the slowly cooling main fire. They shared the stories and legends of their people. Their voices were soft, a little quavering with age, but the words they spoke settled deep in the hearts of the young listeners, passing on the wisdom of generations. They spoke of times when bison on the plains were so numerous that the earth trembled from their mighty stampede for miles around, of their ancestors' encounters with the mysterious little people who dwell in the high mountains, of coyotes' countless tricks, the eternal trickster and deceiver, and of the great wisdom and diligence of Beaver, the dam builder. Swift Deer sat, his back against Singing River's warm shoulder, feeling her calm breath. He gazed at the myriad stars, bright and cold in the clear autumn sky, and thought of his people's future, of the uncertainty that awaited them ahead, in the lands to which they were bound. Far, far away, many days' journey to the east, where once dense ancient forests had rustled, and now only black stumps protruded and acrid smoke from recent conflagrations left by the axes and fire of pale-faced lumberjacks curled, an enormous, emaciated, and gaunt creature emerged from its ravaged and desecrated burrow. Its long body was covered in matted, filthy fur, and its bones jutted sharply beneath taut skin. Its eyes burned with a hungry, frenzied yellow fire in the deepening twilight. The air in these parts was thoroughly permeated with the heavy scent of char, rusted iron, and an alien, aggressive, unfamiliar life. Ancient, primal instinct for survival and an unbearable, all-consuming hunger, a hunger not only physical, but also for its lost home, for peace, and for the familiar, harmonious world, drove this creature away from this defiled, dead place. It moved slowly but inexorably westward. Its animalistic senses unerringly led it to where lands untouched by man and careless, easy prey still remained. Its path lay through ravaged forests, scorched prairies, towards distant mountains, to where shelter and food could still be found. With the first, barely perceptible rays of the rising sun, which gently touched the grass coated in a thin layer of crystalline frost, dyeing it a delicate pink, the quiet water people began their long and arduous journey. All their meager belongings, folded hides, kettles, stores of jerky and roots, weapons and tools, were carefully packed onto the backs of their few, but exceptionally hardy, horses. These horses, with their strong legs and calm temperament, were a true treasure for the tribe. Part of the load was also distributed among the dogs, which diligently pulled travois behind them. These simple yet effective contraptions were made of two long, sturdy poles, connected by crisscrossed leather thongs, forming a platform for baggage. Women, whose endurance was no less than the men's, carried small children on their backs, nestled cozily in special cradle boards, skillfully woven from willow withes and softly lined with moss and fur. The elders, whose bodies no longer possessed their former strength, walked slowly, leaning on sturdy wooden staffs, their faces intent, their eyes carefully watching their footing. Swift Deer, as one of the most experienced and keen-sighted warriors, along with Chief Stronghand, led the vanguard of this small caravan. Their gazes ceaselessly and attentively scanned every bush, every fold in the terrain, every shadow, searching for signs of danger or traces of game. Silent Wolf, whose name spoke for itself, along with several young but already proven warriors, brought up the rear. Their task was not only to guard the rear from sudden attack, but also to meticulously erase the tracks left by the tribe, so as not to attract the attention of unwanted pursuers, be they hostile tribes or predatory beasts. Their path led them from the wide, fertile river valley where they had spent the summer, higher and higher into the harsh foothills. The air here became noticeably thinner and colder. Breathing deeply was more difficult. The lush green grass, familiar to the summer pastures, gradually gave way to sparse, thorny shrubs and the first, still low, coniferous trees, their dark green contrasting sharply with the already withered foliage. The first snow, light and fluffy as swan's down, began to cover the earth with a thin, uneven white blanket. This snow, though beautiful, made it difficult to find tracks of small game, such as hares or partridges, which would supplement their meager food supplies. The nights grew longer and palpably colder. The people had to stop more often for short rests, to build a small fire from kindling gathered along the way. By the fire they warmed their frozen, numb hands and feet, and drank a hot, bitter brew of pine needles, which not only warmed them, but also gave them a little strength. Each such stop was a brief respite before the next leg of the journey. After several days of wearying, monotonous travel, a dark, narrow fissure in a ridge of high, almost sheer cliffs suddenly loomed before the exhausted people. It was the entrance to the Canyon of Winter Winds. The elders of the tribe, keepers of ancient knowledge and lore, said that this canyon was the only path known to them that would allow them to reach Blue Lake, their wintering grounds, before the White Giant, as they called the merciless winter, completely closed all passes and trails with deep, impassable snow. Any detour was too long, would take many weeks, and was extremely dangerous, as it lay through uncharted territories occupied by hostile tribes. Stronghand, pointing to the grim entrance of the gorge with his strong, calloused hand, addressed them all. There in that defile lies our only path to salvation. May the spirits of the rocks, ancient and mighty, be gracious to us and let us pass unharmed. But even from a distance of several hundred yards, the canyon resembled the gaping maw of a colossal stone beast, ready to devour anyone who dared to enter. And the wind that constantly blew from its dark depths carried not only a piercing cold, but also an unsettling, inexplicable whisper that sent shivers down their spines. As the tribe slowly approached the ominous entrance to the canyon, Wise Owl, the old shaman, grew increasingly silent and deeply focused. He would stop now and then, lifting his head and listening to something inaudible to the others, something only his ear, sharpened by years of practice, could catch. Sometimes he would bend down and pick up ordinary stones from the ground, examining them for a long time, turning them in his dry, wrinkled hands as if trying to read some secret signs on their surface or hear their silent stories. The birds, even the boldest, have abandoned these stony slopes, he remarked in a low, concerned voice to Swift Deer, who walked beside him. And even the mountain goats, which usually graze fearlessly here on these ledges, have gone elsewhere. The air here is very heavy. It presses on the chest, makes it hard to breathe. These ancient stones, witnesses of ages, remember something very terrible that happened here long ago. Swift Deer and Silent Wolf, renowned as the tribe's best trackers, whose eyes could discern the faintest trail on any surface, went to reconnoiter the very entrance to the canyon. On the thin, freshly fallen layer of snow that dusted the scree at the foot of the cliffs, they discovered enormous, very deep tracks. These prints were not like a bear's. They were too long and narrow, and the imprints of 5 toes were clearly visible, each ending in the mark of an incredibly long, sharp claw. Nor did they resemble a wolf's for that. They were too large and heavy, judging by the depth to which they had pressed into the snow and the frozen earth beneath. These strange, frightening tracks led directly into the dark maw of the canyon, disappearing into its gloom. Silent Wolf carefully ran his hand along the edge of one of the tracks, trying not to disturb its shape. Whoever left these passed here very recently, this night or early morning, and he is very, very large and incredibly heavy. I have never before seen tracks of such a creature in all my life. His usually calm face expressed an extreme degree of surprise and poorly concealed alarm. Swift Deer and Silent Wolf immediately returned to the main group and reported their disturbing find to Strong Hand and Wise Owl. The chief, the shaman, and several older, most experienced warriors gathered for a brief council right at the edge of the trail leading into the canyon. Stone Fist, whose blood always ran hot and who was always first to rush into battle, impatiently gripped the handle of his massive club. Whoever it is, man or beast, he will soon learn the sharpness of our arrows and the strength of our blows. But Strong Hand, always distinguished by his prudence, raised his hand, urging caution. Do not underestimate an unknown enemy, especially one whose tracks inspire dread. We do not yet know its strength or habits. Wise Owl slowly shook his head, his face very serious, his gaze fixed somewhere in the distance, as if he saw something beyond the material world. This is not merely a beast seeking sustenance. From these tracks emanates an ancient hidden malice and an unnatural power alien to this world. This is one of those whom our ancient legends call the Twisted Spirits, beings who have lost their true form and reason due to great sorrow, unbearable suffering, or dark, evil sorcery directed against them or committed by them. Despite all the ominous signs and grim forebodings, the quiet water people had no choice. Winter was already nipping at their heels. It grew colder with each passing day, and the snowfalls became heavier. To remain in the open foothills meant certain death from hunger and the piercing cold, especially for the old and the young. Strong Hand, after brief but intense deliberation, made the only possible decision. We will enter the canyon. We have no other way. But every warrior must be extremely vigilant and ready for any surprise. We will move as a tight group, not strung out. Fire must burn not only in our hearths at camp, but also in our hearts, giving us courage. May the spirits of our ancestors, who always walk with us and protect us, grant us strength and wisdom to pass this trial." With these words, the chief was the first to step onto the trail leading into the canyon. The entire tribe, clenching their teeth against anxiety and cold, began to slowly file into the narrow, gloomy gorge, leaving behind the last meager rays of the autumn sun and the familiar open world of the river valley. Now uncertainty awaited them, hidden in the shadows of the canyon of winter winds. The canyon immediately squeezed them in its cold stone vise, like a giant serpent slowly tightening its coils around its prey. High, almost sheer walls of gray, lichen-covered rock soared steeply upwards, vanishing somewhere in the grim, low-hanging sky, leaving the people only a narrow, winding ribbon of dim light far above their heads. The sun rarely, if ever, peered into this deep fissure, even on the clearest day. Eternal twilight reigned here. The wind, which constantly howled and darted between the cliffs, created a strange, eerie music, sometimes like the drawn-out moans of unknown creatures, sometimes like a malevolent, barely discernible whisper that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. The snow underfoot grew deeper with every step, transforming from a light powder into a dense, viscous crust that made walking increasingly difficult. It was especially hard for the women, laden with baggage and small children, and for the elders, whose strength was already failing. Every stone that accidentally fell from above, every careless rustle or snap of a dry branch, echoed resoundingly, reverberating between the canyon walls, causing the already tense hearts of the people to contract with anxiety and anticipation of something bad. The journey was hard not only physically but also mentally, weighing on their psyches with its monotony and the constant feeling of enclosed space. Even the most experienced and hardened warriors, who had faced death many times, felt an unpleasant shiver run down their spines from time to time. They constantly imagined that from the numerous dark crevices in the rocks, from behind the huge boulders scattered across the canyon floor, and from the high, barely visible ledges in the semi-darkness, unseen, malevolent eyes were watching them intently. This sensation was almost physical. It was oppressive, forcing them to constantly look over their shoulders. The children, usually noisy and cheerful, were now quiet and began to whimper for no apparent reason, clinging more tightly to their mothers. The dogs, loyal companions and helpers, also behaved restlessly. They whined piteously now and then, pressed against their masters' legs, and the fur on their hackles often bristled, as if they saw or sensed something inaccessible to human perception. Swift Deer, walking in the vanguard, would stop frequently, peering intently into the dense shadows, his right hand involuntarily reaching for his quiver, ready to snatch an arrow at any moment. He noticed strange, very deep scratches on the surface of some rocks left by gigantic claws. These scratches were too high above the ground for an ordinary beast, even for the largest bear or mountain lion, and they looked fresh. They had been made very recently. The short autumn day faded very quickly in the impenetrable depths of the canyon. Twilight here, in this confined space, fell suddenly, almost without transition, transforming the already gloomy outlines of the rocks into monstrous, grotesque figures that came alive in the dancing shadows. Strong Hand, realizing that further progress in the darkness was madness, ordered a halt for the night in a small widening of the gorge, where an overhanging cliff on one side offered some semblance of shelter from wind and rockfall. The people quickly, but without undue fuss, built several fires, using dry wood they had brought and kindling gathered along the way. However, their dim, flickering light only snatched small, cramped islands of safety from the surrounding gloom, making the surrounding shadows even thicker, blacker, and more ominous. Soon after darkness fell, a fierce blizzard began. Snow fell in large, heavy flakes, quickly covering the ground and the people. The wind in the canyon roared with new force, like a huge, wounded beast, its furious howl drowning out all other sounds, even the crackling of the fires and the voices of people trying to shout over the storm. In the midst of this ferocious storm, when visibility was reduced to arm's length and the entire world was plunged into a white, roaring chaos, a piercing scream, full of unutterable horror, suddenly rang out. The scream broke off as abruptly as it had begun. It was Sharpknife, a young, still very inexperienced warrior, whom Swift Deer had sent shortly before to check the very edge of the temporary camp, to ensure all was in place and there were no signs of approaching danger. From the snowy whirlwind, as if woven from primordial darkness and the fury of the blizzard, an enormous, blurred, rapidly moving shadow momentarily burst forth. A short, gurgling cry turning into a rasp was heard. Then the horrifying sound of tearing flesh and the dry, distinct crunch of breaking bones. And after that, everything instantly fell silent, swallowed by the roar of wind and snow. The shadow, as suddenly as it had appeared, vanished back into the snowy vortex, dragging its unfortunate victim with it, leaving almost no trace of its presence. The camp, until that moment plunged into an anxious stupor, exploded in an instant with cries of genuine terror and panic. Women instinctively rushed to their children, trying to shield them with their own bodies from the unknown threat, their lamentations mingling with the howl of the wind. Warriors, snatching knives and axes from their sheaths and knocking arrows to their bowstrings, rushed with desperate cries to help towards the spot from whence Sharpknife's scream had come. But it was too late. Swift Deer and Stone Fist, possessing the greatest speed and strength, were the first to reach the place where, just moments before, the young warrior had been. But they found only churned, freshly disturbed snow, which the blizzard immediately began to cover rapidly, and a few dark, almost black drops of blood that quickly froze and steamed in the icy frost. The creature that had committed this monstrous attack had left no clear tracks in the snow, only a sense of piercing, soul-chilling horror and a faint but repulsive smell of wet, dirty fur and something else, acidic, nauseating, and utterly unfamiliar. When the blizzard finally subsided a little, and the wind no longer howled so fiercely, the warriors, armed with smoking torches of resinous branches, thoroughly searched the camp's surroundings. Sharpknife's body was nowhere to be found. Only a few wretched, bloodied scraps of his leather shirt, caught on a sharp rock outcrop, and a large, dark stain on the snow already beginning to be covered by a fresh layer, testified to the tragedy that had occurred. Now it was perfectly clear to everyone. This was not just an ordinary predator killing for sustenance, like a bear or a pack of wolves. This was something else, something possessing incredible, almost supernatural strength, lightning speed, and inhuman, deliberate cruelty. Stronghand, the tribe's chief, clenched his fists so tightly that his knuckles turned white and his nails dug into his palms. His face, usually calm and wise in the torchlight, resembled a mask carved from cold, hard granite. Wise Owl, standing nearby quietly, almost silently, muttered ancient incantations of protection, his eyes tightly closed, his dry lips barely moving, invoking the aid of guardian spirits. The rest of that terrible night, the exhausted and terrified tribe spent sleeplessly, huddled together in one dense, trembling group around a few smoldering fires. The fires had to be constantly fed with damp, smoky branches, as dry wood was almost gone, and no one dared to venture beyond the illuminated circle. The warriors, forming a tight ring around the women, children, and elders, stared intently into the surrounding darkness, their bows ready, arrows nocked. And then, drowning out even the subsiding howl of the wind, from the dark depths of the canyon from somewhere far off, came a new, even more terrifying sound. It was a long, drawn-out, soul-chilling howl, unlike that of a wolf, a lynx, or any other beast known to them. In this howl, there was an inhuman primal rage, an endless, insatiable hunger, and a kind of eerie, perverted, almost sentient pain that made the blood run cold. Swift Deer, listening to this howl, understood with a heavy heart that the nightmare they had fallen into had only just begun, and that this creature would not leave them in peace. A pale, reluctant dawn barely managed to pierce the dense curtain of low clouds into the gloomy depths of the canyon, its weak, diffused light only emphasizing the desolation and lifelessness of the surrounding landscape. This meager light illuminated the scene of yesterday's tragedy, which appeared before the people's eyes in all its starkness. The place where, just a few hours before, the young warrior Sharp Knife had been brutally attacked and carried away, looked like an arena of a short but incredibly fierce and bloody reprisal. Churned snow trampled into the ground, a few dark stains already dusted with fresh powder. That was all that remained of the incident. The Quiet Water people were crushed, their spirits broken by this first, so sudden and brutal, blow. The women, gathered in a small group, quietly, almost silently, mourned the fallen youth, their restrained weeping like the plaintive cry of a wounded forest bird that had lost its chicks. The men stood grim and silent, their faces stern, their hearts filled not only with grief for their comrade, but also with a dull, helpless rage towards the unknown enemy. Wise Owl, overcoming his own fatigue and anguish, performed a short but deeply meaningful farewell ritual. He sprinkled the spot of Sharp Knife's death with a pinch of sacred tobacco mixed with dry wormwood, and in a low voice asked the youth spirit to find a peaceful path to the land of ancestors, and not to remain a restless ghost in this cursed, ominous gorge. Strong Hand, the chief, gathered Swift Deer, Wise Owl, and the few senior warriors who still retained the ability to think clearly in this dire situation around the barely smoldering, almost extinguished fire. "We must understand who or what we are dealing with," the chief said firmly but quietly, his voice hoarse from the sleepless night and the shock he had endured. "To know the enemy is to have a chance at victory." Swift Deer, who had been closest to the site of the attack, described in detail the little he had managed to notice or sense in that brief, chaotic moment. The incredible, almost unbelievable speed of the shadow's movement, its enormous, crushing physical strength, and its utterly indistinct, blurred outlines, as if it were woven from the gloom itself. wise owl who had been silent for a long time, lost in thought, finally slowly raised his head and spoke in a deep, even voice. The ancient legends of our grandfathers and great-grandfathers speak of terrible beings born from the disruption of the great balance in the world, from the disharmony between light and darkness. When a human or even a spirit turns away from the light of the true path and completely immerses itself in the darkness of insatiable hunger, endless rage, and forbidden desires, it transforms into a Wendigo, a horrific devourer of human flesh, eternally tormented. But this, what we have encountered here, smells different. It has a different aura. This is what other tribes, who knew the pale-faced newcomers longer than us and suffered more from them, call a werewolf, a creature capable of changing its form, a human who became a beast as a result of a curse or their own evil will, acquiring diabolical cunning and treachery. It was undoubtedly driven from its ancestral lands, its world destroyed, and now it brings its unbearable pain, its anger, and its fury here, to our lands. As soon as the blizzard had completely subsided and the wind calmed, allowing details to be seen, Swift Deer and Silent Wolf, wasting no time, set out again on reconnaissance to thoroughly inspect the vicinity of the night's camp. This time they were luckier. They found new tracks left by the creature, and these tracks were no longer as smeared and indistinct as those they had seen at the canyon entrance. They were enormous, shaped like the prints of giant wolf paws, but with clear imprints of 5 toes on each paw and deep furrows from incredibly long and sharp claws, capable of easily tearing the bark of ancient trees or even stone. The tracks sometimes approached the tribe's encampment, then retreated again, as if the creature had been circling them for a long time, observing the people, choosing the moment to attack. The trackers carefully noted the depth of the prints in the snow, trying to estimate the creature's weight by this sign, and measured its stride length to get an idea of its height and speed. Not far from the site of the attack on Sharp Knife, on a sharp rock outcrop where the creature had apparently snagged itself during its swift lunge, they found several tufts of coarse, matted fur of a dark brown, almost black color. A faint but very unpleasant, repulsive odor of decaying organic matter and something metallic, like the smell of congealed blood or rust, emanated from these tufts. It was becoming increasingly clear that the werewolf, or whatever this creature was called, was not merely hungry and looking for easy prey. It seemed to derive a perverse pleasure from the fear of its victims, from the panic it sowed among them. The following night, its soul-chilling howl echoed first from one side of the canyon, then from the other, giving the exhausted people no moment of peace, allowing no one to sleep, gradually wearing down their already strained nerves to the limit. During the day, the warrior scouts whom Strong Hand sent ahead and to the flanks found its fresh tracks very close to the trail, along which the tribe slowly moved. Sometimes it walked almost parallel to them, only a few dozen yards away, hiding behind rocks, dense juniper thickets, or the trunks of the sparse trees here. It did not attack the main group openly, but its unseen, ominous presence was felt with every fiber, every nerve. Soon, one of the dogs, which had carelessly strayed from the caravan while chasing some small animal, disappeared without a trace. It was found only the next day, torn apart with a particular demonstrative cruelty, not to satisfy hunger, but as a warning or a malicious taunt. Strong Hand and Swift Deer, after consulting, decided to immediately change the tribe's order of movement to maximize the people's safety. The tribe was now to march in the tightest possible dense group, not strung out along the narrow canyon floor. Warriors, armed with bows with arrows nocked and carrying burning torches, even during the day, formed a tight ring around the women, children, and elders walking in the center. At halts, especially at night, a strict watch rotation was established. 2 or 3 warriors always remained awake, carefully observing the surrounding darkness, while the others could rest in snatches without removing their weapons. Swift Deer suggested using some particularly narrow places in the canyon, where the walls almost closed in, to organize a defense if the creature decided on an open attack. But Strong Hand expressed concern that in such a confined space, they themselves would become easy targets if the werewolf possessed the ability to attack from above, leaping from high ledges. Wise Owl, understanding that physical strength and weapons might not be enough to combat such an enemy, slept very little, spending long hours in prayer and ritual. He constantly appealed to his spirit helpers, to the spirits of ancestors, asking for their protection and counsel. He burned sacred herbs, sage, cedar needles, wormwood, in a small brazier, the smoke of which, according to ancient beliefs, possessed the power to ward off evil spirits and purify space. He drew complex protective symbols on the palms and chests of Swift Deer and other young warriors with bright red ochre and black charcoal, investing these drawings with all the strength of his faith. He spoke at length with Swift Deer, recounting ancient legends and tales of past heroes who had once vanquished various monsters and evil spirits, trying to find in these ancient stories a key to understanding the nature of this new, terrible enemy, to find its possible weaknesses. Every being, even the darkest and most powerful, has its shadow, its vulnerable spot. It's Achilles' heel, he said in a low, confident voice. One only needs to be able to find it, to unravel its secret. Stone Fist, whose hot blood and impatient nature did not allow him to endure this passive waiting and constant tension for long, persuaded several equally young and desperate warriors to set an ambush for the werewolf. They had noticed fresh tracks leading into one of the narrower side gorges and decided this was a chance to catch the beast off guard and attack it first. However, the werewolf, as if sensing their intentions or possessing an incredible intuition, attacked first itself, suddenly leaping out from behind a huge moss-covered boulder as the warriors carelessly approached its supposed lair. It moved with incredible, unimaginable speed, its enormous body making almost no sound, and its long, sharp claws flashed in the dim twilight of the gorge. One of the warriors, a young and agile man named Nimble Serpent, didn't even have time to raise his spear before receiving a terrible, deep wound on his arm from a swipe of a clawed paw, before the other hunters could recover and release their arrows. The arrows, fired in haste, either flew past the rapidly moving target or bounced off the creature's thick, coarse hide, causing no visible harm. The werewolf, uttering a short, vicious sound like a growl or a cough, vanished as suddenly as it had appeared into the dense shadows of the gorge, leaving behind only the cries of their wounded comrade, the scent of its fur, and even greater despair and fear in the hearts of the people. Nimble Serpent's wound, sustained in the clash with the unknown creature, looked truly horrific. Its edges were jagged and torn, as if the flesh had been ripped out by a blunt but immensely powerful instrument. The skin around the wound quickly turned a dark crimson, almost black, and began to swell noticeably, becoming hot to the touch. Singing River, who possessed some knowledge of herbal medicine along with other women of the tribe, immediately began to tend to the wounded man. They carefully cleansed the deep wound with a warm decoction made from willow bark, known for its disinfectant properties, and applied a poultice of thoroughly mashed fresh plantain leaves, hoping to stop the bleeding and reduce inflammation. However, despite all their efforts, Nimble Serpent's high fever did not subside. His body was racked by violent shivers, and his consciousness began to cloud. Wise Owl, seeing the warrior's grave condition, performed a lengthy healing ritual over him, quietly whispering ancient words of power known only to him and fumigating the wounded man with the smoke of specially selected medicinal herbs. But his face grew darker and more worried with each passing minute. He understood that ordinary, time-tested remedies were powerless here against wounds inflicted by the claws of such an unusual and malevolent creature. The fear of the werewolf in people's hearts intensified manifold. Now everyone realized with horror that its claws carried not only swift death on the battlefield, but also an agonizing, unknown disease or poison from which there was no escape. The werewolf, as if sensing the growing fear and despair of its pursuers, or simply reveling in its impunity, changed its tactics, becoming even more cunning and unpredictable. It no longer attempted to attack the main, well-guarded group of people. Instead, it began to deliberately stalk and attack those who separated from the others, even for a short time and a small distance. Sentries changing posts in the pre-dawn or evening twilight. Warriors who carelessly wandered from the camp in search of kindling for the fire or to hunt small game. Its attacks always occurred suddenly, from the most unexpected places. It would leap from an overhanging cliff above the trail, burst out from dense, impenetrable thickets of thorny juniper that grew on the canyon slopes, or emerge from a dark, narrow crevice in the rock where it was impossible to spot beforehand. Now it did not always kill its victim immediately. Sometimes it would only severely maim, inflicting terrible but not fatal wounds, and leave the unfortunate soul groaning and calling for help, to attract other members of the tribe to that spot, and thereby sow even greater panic, terror, and confusion in their ranks, playing on their feelings of compassion and camaraderie. Silent Wolf, renowned as the tribe's finest tracker, whose eyes were sharper than a falcon's, and saw what was completely hidden from others, and whose ears caught the slightest rustle from many hundreds of yards away, made a desperate decision. He resolved to try alone to track this cunning and elusive werewolf to its lair. He sincerely believed he could move through the canyon more quietly than the lightest breeze and remain completely unnoticed by the creature's keen hearing and sense of smell. He left at dawn, as the first gray rays just began to penetrate the gorge, leaving for Swift Deer, his closest friend, a prearranged sign of several specially arranged twigs by the trail, indicating the direction he intended to move. By evening of that same day, Silent Wolf had not returned to camp, and no prearranged signals given by the warriors received a response. Swift Deer, seized by a heavy, ill foreboding that gripped his heart like an icy vice, gathered a small party of the bravest warriors, and immediately set off on his trail, while it could still be discerned in the deepening twilight. After some time, they found the scene of a desperate, furious struggle. Silent Wolf's spear, his favorite weapon, broken in half, lay on the ground. Nearby were deep, fresh furrows from someone's enormous claws on the frozen earth and on the trunks of the few crooked trees growing there, as well as his old wolf fur cap, soaked in dark, congealed blood. Silent Wolf's body itself was nowhere to be found. This loss was a terrible, crushing blow to the entire tribe, for Silent Wolf was not only a brave and skilled warrior, but also an irreplaceable keeper of much unique knowledge about tracks, the habits of wild animals, and the secrets of survival in the harsh wilderness. Stone Fist, witnessing the death of his friends one after another and observing the agonizing suffering of the wounded who could not be healed, fell into a state of deep, unbridled fury bordering on despair. His usually loud, booming voice became hoarse and cracked with the emotions overwhelming him. At the next halt, when the tribe stopped for a short rest, he could bear it no longer and openly challenged Strong Hand's authority. "We sit here in this cursed canyon like cowardly rabbits in their burrow, just waiting for this vile creature to pick us off one by one. Why don't we gather all our strength and give it a real fight? Better to die with honor, weapon in hand, fighting for our lives and the lives of our loved ones, than to tremble with fear every night and await our terrible fate." Several young, hot-headed warriors, whose patience was also at its limit, supported his angry words with loud shouts. Swift Deer, possessing greater composure and prudence, had to intervene and exert considerable effort to prevent open conflict and a split among the already few defenders of the tribe. But even he, deep down, felt that their patience, their strength, and their hopes were rapidly dwindling with each passing day, with each new loss. Swift Deer, despite the bitterness of recent losses and the general despondency, forced himself to continue thinking, analyzing the situation, searching for a way out. Over and over, down to the smallest detail, he replayed in his mind the specifics of each werewolf attack, each encounter with it, each track it left. He noticed one important detail. The werewolf, despite all its fury and apparent invulnerability, always avoided approaching large, brightly and hotly burning fires, preferring to attack from the darkness or in twilight. He also remembered that during the last unsuccessful skirmish, when one of the fire arrows, shot at random by one of the warriors, accidentally hit the creature's thick fur on its side, it had howled especially loudly and piercingly, not like from an ordinary wound, and had immediately leaped back, furiously shaking itself and rolling in the snow, trying to extinguish the flames. Fire. The thought slowly formed in his mind. It fears fire much more than any ordinary beast. Fire causes it particular pain. Furthermore, at the site of the last skirmish, where Silent Wolf was presumed to have died, Swift Deer found a strange, broken claw that had snapped off the creature during the struggle. This claw was very large and sharp, but unnaturally light for its size and somewhat porous at the break, as if it were partially hollow inside or made of an unusual material. Wise Owl, seeing that his people's spirit was almost completely broken by despair and a string of failures, and that they were beginning to lose their last faith in salvation, decided to perform the most powerful and most ancient of all sacred rites known to him, the rite of invoking the aid of the mighty spirits of ancestor warriors, who were once famed for their strength and valor. Deep in the night, in a small place sheltered from the piercing wind, slightly aside from the main camp, he kindled a small sacred fire, using only dry branches of the sacred oak, symbolizing strength, and cedar, representing longevity and purity. He began to chant an ancient, monotonous song in the language of his forefathers, slowly and rhythmically beating his old, mystery-marked drum of tightly stretched deerskin. His voice sometimes soared high up to the cold stars, then dropped to a barely audible, almost hypnotic whisper. Gradually, he entered a deep trance. His body began to tremble finely, and his eyes rolled back. When he came to himself some time later, his usually dull eyes burned with a new, bright light, as if something unearthly were reflected in them. "The spirits of our great ancestors have told me," he addressed Swift Deer, who had approached, his voice sounding unusually strong and confident, "that this creature we have encountered is unclean in its nature. Its immense power lies in its insatiable rage, and in the alien pain it has absorbed. But fire, as you have already noticed, purifies all in its path, and it fears fire. And that which is born from the very heart of Mother Earth and has passed through purifying fire, that is metal, can wound it much more deeply and painfully than ordinary stone or bone. Seek the silver tear of the moon. So our ancestors called silver. Even its smallest fragment will prove decisive. Inspired by the old shaman's words, which gave them a new, albeit faint, hope, and simultaneously pushed by encroaching despair, Swift Deer and the few most resolute warriors remaining with him decided to set a new, more carefully planned trap, this time actively using fire. They chose a particularly narrow passage in the canyon, where on both sides they piled up large heaps of dry branches, dead wood, and resinous kindling. Their plan was to lure the werewolf into this narrow passage and then simultaneously set the combustible material ablaze from both sides, cutting off the creature's escape route and surrounding it with a wall of flame. A young but very fast and agile warrior named Fleet-Footed Deer volunteered to be the bait, risking his own life. The werewolf, attracted by the scent of a human and the smoke from a small decoy fire, soon appeared out of the darkness. But it proved incredibly cunning and cautious. It saw through their design. It did not walk straight into the trap. Instead, with astonishing agility, it climbed an almost sheer, smooth cliff face, clinging with its enormous claws to the slightest protrusions, and unexpectedly leaped down from above, right behind the unsuspecting Fleet-Footed Deer. It killed the youth with a single lightning-fast blow before he could utter a single cry or attempt to defend himself. The fire, which the warriors, seeing this, despairingly managed to light, only brightly illuminated this horrific scene of slaughter and simultaneously cut off their own path to pursue the creature. The werewolf, uttering a short, triumphant, malevolent growl, once again instantly vanished into the surrounding darkness, leaving behind another innocent victim, the smell of blood and the thick, acrid smoke from the uselessly blazing fire, which only underscored their latest defeat. The complete failure of the carefully planned fire trap and the tragic sudden death of the young warrior Fleet-Footed Deer initially plunged Swift Deer into a state of deep, almost paralyzing despair. All their efforts had been in vain, the enemy invincible. However, this oppressive feeling soon gave way to cold, calculated resolve. He realized with utmost clarity that the werewolf they faced was not only incredibly strong physically, but also possessed an almost human, devious intellect, multiplied by primal, bestial cunning and cruelty. Against such an adversary, ordinary hunting tricks and simple traps were useless. He needed to learn to think like it, to try to anticipate its moves, to preempt its actions. Swift Deer mentally replayed again and again all the details he had managed to observe. The creature's evident fear of large open fire, the strange, light and porous claw he had found, Wise Owl's enigmatic words about the silver tier of the moon and metal passed through fire. He felt that the key to victory was hidden somewhere here, in these seemingly disparate observations and predictions. Based on his reflections, Swift Deer proposed a new tactic to his tribesmen, one entirely based on the constant and active use of fire, not only for defense, but also for attack. He suggested moving through the canyon only during daylight hours, trying to choose the most open and well-lit areas where the shadow would have less chance to hide. For the night, the camp was to be surrounded not just by a few separate fires, but by a veritable continuous ring of fire. Large, hot bonfires placed very close to each other, which had to be maintained throughout the dark, anxious night, never allowing them to die down for a moment. Furthermore, every warrior on duty or simply moving about the camp constantly carried a well-burning torch, made of resinous pine splinters or dry branches wrapped in tow. Several of the best arrows were specially prepared. Their shafts near the arrowhead were carefully wrapped with tufts of dry grass and bits of tow soaked in rendered animal fat. Such arrows could be quickly ignited from the nearest fire and used as fire arrows, carrying not only injury but also searing flame, which their enemy so feared. Wise Owl, fully supporting Swift Deer's initiative and following the instructions he claimed to have received from the spirits during his trance, performed a special ritual of consecrating the weapons. He carefully took the best arrowheads, made of a rare, very hard black stone similar to obsidian, highly valued for its sharpness, and thoroughly washed them in a strong, bitter infusion of wormwood and juniper, herbs known for their purifying and protective properties. During this ablution, he softly chanted ancient words of power, invoking guardian spirits to imbue these weapons with special might. At this time, Singing River, Swift Deer's wife, remembered a small silver ornament she had kept since childhood. It was a thin, artfully made plate with an engraved pattern, inherited from her mother, who, in turn, had traded it many years ago from a wandering merchant from the south. With a heavy heart, understanding the gravity of the moment, she gave this precious item to Wise Owl. The old shaman, using 2 smooth river stones as a hammer and anvil with great difficulty and patience, flattened the thin silver plate, and then carefully, using a sharp bone awl, embedded tiny pieces of this precious metal into specially made slits on several of the best arrows intended for Swift Deer. He meticulously secured these silver inlays with hot pine resin and thin, strong deer sinew. Silver, he solemnly intoned, handing the consecrated arrows to Swift Deer, carries the pure and cold light of the moon, a light hostile to darkness. It can burn and wound that which is born of shadow far more severely than any other metal or stone. To not only raise the rapidly falling morale of the exhausted tribe, but also to attempt to exert psychological influence on the werewolf itself, Wise Owl suggested using the power of sound. He explained to the warriors that creatures like their enemy, whose soul and body were distorted by evil, were particularly sensitive to certain sound vibrations and rhythms that disrupted their internal harmony or caused physical discomfort. Therefore, during night encampments, in addition to creating an impenetrable ring of fire, the warriors took turns singing quiet but internally powerful and confident songs of strength, the ancient battle hymns of their people, and the shaman himself, sitting by the main fire, rhythmically and continuously beat his sacred drum, covered with complex symbolic drawings of the sun, moon, stars, and totem animals. These sounds, merging, created a kind of invisible sound barrier around the camp and caused the werewolf distress, disorienting it, forcing it to keep its distance. The werewolf, undoubtedly possessing keen hearing and animalistic senses, clearly felt the change in the people's behavior and tactics. It no longer dared to make direct and open attacks on the well-protected camp, surrounded by a wall of roaring fire and filled with the unfamiliar disturbing sounds of the drum and ritual chants. But it did not leave entirely, did not abandon its victims. Its furious, soul-chilling howl now echoed even more frequently than before, and in it new notes were clearly audible. Notes of extreme frustration, malice, and some confusion. Sometimes, especially in the darkest hours before dawn, it would approach very close to the ring of fire, so close that its enormous, grotesque shadow would momentarily flicker beyond the flames, causing a new wave of fear among the sentries. It began to throw heavy stones or chunks of ice towards the camp, dislodging them from the canyon slopes, trying thereby to provoke the people into reckless actions, to frighten them, and to find a breach in their reinforced defenses. Swift Deer and his few warriors responded to these provocations only with a demonstrative waving of burning torches and rare, well-aimed shots from their bows, trying not to waste precious, especially consecrated arrows needlessly. One night, when the tension reached its peak, the werewolf, driven to extremes by the insatiable hunger that had tormented it for many days, and by blind rage at its inability to reach its desired prey, made a desperate, almost suicidal attempt to break through the fiery barrier. It made a swift, lightning-fast dash between two bonfires, at a spot where the flames had momentarily weakened due to a strong gust of wind. Swift Deer, who had anticipated just such a moment and had pre-selected the most advantageous position for shooting, reacted immediately. He smoothly drew his bowstring and loosed one of those precious arrows with the small silver tip. The arrow, guided by a steady hand full of cold determination and despair, whistled through the night air and struck the werewolf deep in the shoulder, just as it had almost breached the fiery barrier. A deafening, unearthly, blood-curdling shriek erupted, a mixture of unbearable pain, insane fury, and utter surprise, as if the creature had not expected such power from this weapon. The werewolf recoiled sharply, dark, almost black, steaming blood gushing profusely from its deep wound. With a prolonged, agonized howl, it lunged away from the ring of fire and instantly vanished into the surrounding darkness, leaving behind on the snow only a few drops of its strange, unnatural blood and a faint smell of singed fur. This small but crucial victory, the first real, serious wound inflicted on this almost invulnerable monster, somewhat uplifted the exhausted, nearly hopeless tribe. They had seen with their own eyes that the werewolf was not absolutely invulnerable, that it could be wounded and killed. However, Wise Owl, while sharing the general joy, still felt it his duty to caution the warriors against excessive euphoria. A wounded white bear is the most dangerous and unpredictable beast in the forest. And a wounded spirit of darkness like this one will seek revenge with threefold cunning, treachery, and malice. It has well remembered the unbearable pain that silver inflicted upon it. Be assured, it will now be even more cautious, even more cunning, and even more dangerous. And indeed his words were soon confirmed. In the following days, the werewolf became almost invisible and inaudible. Its furious howl ceased completely. It stopped approaching the camp and throwing stones. But the tension did not lessen. On the contrary, it even intensified. Everyone understood that it was somewhere nearby, lying in wait, licking its wound, biding its time for a new, even more terrible attack. And its hatred for the people who had caused it pain had grown even stronger and deeper. After Swift Deer managed to wound the werewolf with the silver-tipped arrow, several days of deceptive, almost unnatural calm ensued. The creature no longer attacked the camp openly. Its soul-chilling howl did not echo through the nights. But its unseen, oppressive presence was felt by all members of the tribe like a heavy weight on their shoulders, a constant, silent threat. The tribe, gathering its last strength, continued its slow, grueling journey along the canyon floor, which grew narrower, more winding and gloomier with each passing day. The enormous sheer cliffs now closed in so tightly above their heads that the sky became a thin, barely visible gray ribbon of light far above. Every new turn in the gorge, every dark, gaping crevice in the rock, every dense bush clinging to the stones, concealed a deadly threat, forcing the warriors to be constantly on alert. The food supplies brought from the summer encampment were rapidly dwindling, and hunting in this lifeless canyon yielded almost no results. Firewood for maintaining the large protective bonfires also became scarcer. They had to use damp, smoky branches that provided little warmth but much acrid smoke. The people were exhausted to the limit, their faces gaunt and darkened from fatigue and lack of sleep, their eyes shining feverishly in the semi-darkness from constant tension and fear. The werewolf, having managed to lick its wound clean, the wound from the silver arrow healed unnaturally fast, but left behind an ugly, deep scar, making its already hideous appearance even more frightening. Soon began its sophisticated cold revenge. It no longer attacked people openly, fearing fire and silver. Instead, it started to perpetrate small but very agonizing and exhausting acts of malice, aimed at breaking the people's spirit, depriving them of their last strength and hope. It managed to spoil their last carefully guarded supplies of drinking water by throwing dead small rodents or clumps of mud into leather water skins left unattended for a short time. At night, it destroyed temporary, hastily built shelters of branches and hides that people constructed for protection against cold and wind. It began to cause small but very dangerous rockfalls from the high upper ledges of the canyon, choosing the moment when the tribe was passing beneath them. This forced people to scatter in panic, risking the lives of children and weakened elders who could not move quickly. One night, it slaughtered all the remaining dogs of the tribe, loyal helpers and guardians, doing so with particular demonstrative cruelty, leaving their mangled, mutilated bodies directly on the trail where the tribe was to pass, as another gruesome warning and reminder of its power. Then the creature resorted to a new, truly diabolical ruse to finally break the will and reason of the tormented people. playing on their most profound feelings and fears. From the surrounding darkness, from behind the high cliffs, from the depths of dark-side gorges and crevices, various voices began to emanate. Sometimes it was the plaintive cry of a small child, which in tone and intonation was exactly like the cry of the son of one of the young women of the tribe, who had recently lost her husband. Sometimes it was a distinct call by name, in a voice astonishingly similar to singing rivers, addressed to swift deer when he was on watch. Sometimes, which was especially terrifying, these were the voices of already deceased warriors. Sharp Knife, Silent Wolf, Fleet-footed Deer, calling their still living brothers in arms to join them in the land of shadows. These auditory hallucinations created by the werewolf literally drove people mad, shattering their psyche. Several times, grief-stricken mothers, hearing the cries of their children, nearly rushed towards these ghostly sounds, running beyond the circle of firelight, and were restrained with great difficulty by other women and warriors. Strong Hand had to issue the strictest order. No one was to believe any sound, any voice heard from outside the circle of firelight, to consider it all merely the machinations of an evil spirit. The constant, exhausting fear of an unseen but ubiquitous enemy, the gnawing hunger that grew ever stronger, the sleepless, anxiety-ridden nights, and this unceasing psychological pressure from the werewolf began to bear their poisonous fruit. Within the already weakened tribe, a serious schism began to brew, threatening to escalate into open rebellion. Stone Fist, whose fury had only intensified after the death of his friends, and several equally desperate young warriors who had lost all hope, once again began to openly demand immediate and decisive action from Chief Strong Hand. They proposed either to try to break out of this cursed canyon at any cost, regardless of losses, and reach open space as quickly as possible, or to gather all remaining men and organize a large final hunt for the werewolf, even if it cost them all their lives. The elders and most of the women, on the contrary, fell into a state of complete apathy and hopelessness. They merely prayed quietly to the spirits for salvation, but at the same time feared any sudden movement, any change to the familiar, albeit terrible, order of things. It took Strong Hand and Swift Deer enormous, superhuman efforts to maintain even a semblance of order, discipline, and unity in the ranks of their tormented people, preventing them from completely disintegrating. Swift Deer, unlike many, did not succumb to despair and continued to think intently. He understood perfectly well that further passive waiting and a purely defensive tactic would inevitably lead them all to a slow but certain doom, either from hunger and cold or from the werewolf's claws and fangs. It was imperative to try to seize the initiative, to impose their will on the enemy. He firmly decided that such a large and strong creature as the werewolf must have a permanent lair somewhere in this canyon, a place where it rested after its forays, where it felt safe, and therefore might be most vulnerable. If they could find this lair, they could try to set an ambush there, or at least learn more about its nature, habits, and find its weaknesses. Under the cover of a thick pre-dawn fog, which often settled on the canyon floor, taking with him only one, the quietest, most resilient and reliable young warrior named Keen Eye, armed only with a bow, arrows, and a light spear, Swift Deer set out on this extremely dangerous reconnaissance. They moved with utmost caution, trying to walk against the wind so as not to betray their scent to the creature's keen olfaction, and carefully, literally inch by inch, examined every dark crevice, every small cave, every rockfall on their path. After several long, tense hours of fruitless searching, as the sun began to noticeably dip towards the west and the shadows in the canyon lengthened, Swift Deer and his companion finally found what they had been so persistently seeking. The entrance to a fairly large cave was artfully concealed behind dense, almost impassable thickets of thorny blackthorn and a large jumble of enormous fallen rocks, making it nearly invisible from the side. From the dark depths of this cave, a palpable sepulchral cold emanated, and an almost unbearable, nauseating stench spread. A repulsive mixture of rotting flesh, damp, musty earth, something akin to sulfur, and some other acrid chemical substance that immediately made their eyes water and their throats scratch. Peering cautiously inside, trying not to make the slightest noise, they saw a truly horrifying sight that made their blood run cold. On the earthen floor of the cave were scattered numerous gnawed bones of various animals and, most terrifyingly, human bones, remnants of tattered clothing, and broken weapons of their fallen comrades. In the farthest, darkest corner of the cave, there was a semblance of a huge, filthy den constructed from old, half-rotten animal skins, dry branches, grass, and clumps of stinking greenish moss. There was no doubt. This was not just a wild beast's lair. It was a veritable shrine of primordial evil, the dwelling place of their merciless enemy. Swift Deer and his young companion, struggling to suppress the nausea rising in their throats and the chilling horror that gripped them, quickly, but with all due caution, returned to the main group of the tribe. Swift Deer immediately reported his dreadful discovery to Strong Hand and Wise Owl. This cave was undoubtedly the heart of the darkness exuded by the werewolf, its citadel, but it could also, with the right approach, become its grave. During a short but intense discussion, a desperate, risky plan was born to try to lure the werewolf out of its lair and give it a decisive battle in a more open but carefully prepared defensive position, located near the very exit of the canyon, which by their calculations was not far off. Or if luring it out failed, to consider another option: to try to collapse heavy rocks and block the cave entrance, thus entombing the creature inside, or to smoke it out with thick, acrid smoke from a large fire made of poisonous plants and damp, smoky branches, then attack the weakened, disoriented enemy. All the warriors present at this council understood perfectly well. This was their last, most realistic chance for salvation. Either they would finally manage to destroy this terrible shadow that haunted them, or this shadow would inevitably consume them all one by one, wiping the quiet water people from the face of the earth. Under the thick, impenetrable cloak of a starless night, by a small fire carefully sheltered from prying eyes and wind, its flames barely illuminating their emaciated faces, Strong Hand gathered all the men of the tribe who were still capable of firmly holding a weapon and fighting. No more than a dozen remained, a handful of warriors against a powerful and cunning enemy. These men's faces were etched with the wrinkles of fatigue and hardship, their eyes deeply sunken from sleepless nights and constant tension. But in their very depths, despite everything, a faint but stubborn fire of desperation still burned, mixed with the last almost extinguished spark of hope for salvation. "My brothers," the old chief's voice was low, almost a whisper, so as not to attract attention. but each of his words sounded firm and weighty. We have lost too many on this cursed path. Their brave spirits now call to us from the land of eternal hunting, awaiting vengeance. We cannot. We have no right to allow this dark shadow, this spawn of evil, to completely erase our people from the face of the earth, to sever the thread of our life. Tomorrow, with the first rays of the sun, we will give this monster its final decisive battle. We will fight not for blind revenge, though it boils in our hearts, but above all, for the lives of our wives, our children, and our elders who depend on us. Then Swift Deer spoke. In a calm, even voice, he detailed the plan he had developed. At dawn, 2 of the fastest and bravest volunteers would go to the werewolf's lair and try to lure it out. Then lead the enraged beast to a pre-selected spot near the canyon exit, where the other warriors would have already prepared a trap and would be waiting for the enemy. With the first barely perceptible rays of dawn, which painted the mountaintops a soft, rosy gray, the remnants of the quiet water people began their slow, agonizing advance towards the presumed exit of the canyon. Swift Deer and several of the most experienced warriors walked slightly ahead of the main group, carefully selecting and preparing the site for the impending final, desperate battle. After a short search, they found a small, relatively flat area, roughly 50 by 30 yards, which was tightly enclosed on 3 sides by high, almost sheer, smooth cliffs, which should limit the maneuverability of their enormous opponent. The 4th side of this area led to a narrow, winding passage between the rocks. This was the only escape route for the women, children, and elders if the battle did not go according to plan. An important advantage of this location was that some dry brush grew here, and several wind-felled trees lay about, which could be used to build large bonfires necessary for illumination and to intimidate the werewolf. The battle site had to be such as to maximally restrict the freedom of movement and attack of the huge, strong werewolf, yet at the same time give a tactical advantage to the archers and spearmen of the quiet water people, who would attack the enemy from different pre-prepared positions, using natural cover, while the women and elders, under the guidance of an old and wise woman named Wind Mother, hastily set up a temporary shelter for the children in the farthest and most protected crevice from stray arrows and stones, and frantically gathered all available fuel for future fires. The few remaining warriors prepared their weapons and their spirits for the last time before battle. They drew their bowstrings to their limits, testing their strength, meticulously inspecting the sharpness and secureness of the arrowheads and spear points, points made of hard flint, razor-sharp obsidian, and those few, especially precious ones, into which Wise Owl had embedded tiny pieces of purifying silver. Wise Owl, gathering the warriors around him, performed the most sacred and powerful ritual known to him. He carefully painted on their faces, chests, and arms the sacred symbols of their totem animals. The mighty bear, to impart unbreakable strength, the keen-sighted eagle, to sharpen vision and accuracy, and the ferocious wolf, for fearlessness and indomitability in battle. For this he used bright red ochre mixed with rendered bear fat and the ashes of burned sacred herbs. During this ritual he sang a quiet but deeply powerful and faithful song in the ancient language of his ancestors, addressing the Great Spirit and guardian spirits. asking for courage and fortitude for the living and an easy, bright path for those destined to fall in this unequal struggle. It was simultaneously an ancient battle ritual, bestowing strength and a farewell to those who would not return from battle. Singing River silently, her eyes full of tears she tried to hide, approached Swift Deer and handed him her last, most precious amulet, a small, smooth river stone with a natural hole in the middle, which she had found in her distant childhood and had never parted with since. This stone was for her a symbol of her unwavering faith in him and her boundless love. The women of the tribe, under the leadership of the experienced and judicious Wind Mother, set up a shelter for the smallest and most defenseless the children in the most remote and secure deep crevice between the rocks, barricading its entrance with stones and branches. They also, with feverish haste, gathered everything that could burn, dry branches, bark, grass, even old worn-out items, to be able to maintain large, hot fires around the entire perimeter of the chosen battle site. Their difficult task was not only to save the children's lives from a direct attack by the monster, but also to create an insurmountable light and fire barrier for it, which would blind it and restrict its movements. In addition, they had to be ready at any moment during the battle to provide the fighting warriors with fresh water to drink, bring additional arrows or javelins, and also, if necessary, provide first aid and bandage the wounds of those who would still be able to continue fighting. The fear that could be read in their wide-open eyes was mixed with a grim, almost desperate determination to do everything possible to save their people. Two of the fastest, most agile, and simultaneously most desperate young warriors, Turtle Shell for his endurance and Flying Squirrel for his nimbleness, volunteered for the most dangerous part of the plan, to lure the werewolf from its gloomy lair. They took with them several well-burning torches and some dry, easily flammable grass to create as much smoke and noise as possible at the cave entrance, thereby enraging and provoking the beast. Then they were to run for their lives, without looking back, at the limit of their abilities, to the place where the ambush awaited them, trying to leave a clearly visible trail behind them, which the enraged and anger-blinded werewolf could not fail to notice and follow. The entire tribe, except for these two brave souls, froze in tense, agonizing anticipation on the prepared site. The silence that reigned in the canyon became almost unbearable, pressing on their ears. Only the mournful whistling of the wind in the narrow rock crevices and the deafeningly loud thumping of their own hearts in their chests could be heard, counting down the last minutes before the decisive clash. First, from a distance, from the depths of the canyon, came a barely audible but gradually intensifying roar, full of primal fury and pain, from which even the massive stones underfoot trembled slightly. Then came the heavy, frequent, rapidly approaching thud of enormous paws, which grew louder and more distinct with each second, striking terror into the hearts of those waiting. And then, finally, it appeared on the platform, the werewolf in all its monstrous glory. This time it seemed even larger, even more terrifying, and even more ferocious than ever before. Its thick, matted, dark brown fur stood on end all over its body, like the quills of an enraged porcupine, making its silhouette even more massive. Its eyes burned with a frenzied crimson-red fire, reflecting the flames of the bonfires. From its enormous wide-open maw, full of long, dagger-sharp fangs, foamy, fetid saliva dripped profusely, mixed with dark, almost black blood from old or fresh wounds. It saw the people before it, the brightly blazing fires, and for one brief moment it froze, assessing the situation, realizing that this was a carefully prepared trap. But its insane rage, the tormenting, insatiable hunger, and the all-consuming hatred for all living things proved stronger than its instinct for self-preservation. It let out a deafening, ear-splitting, soul-chilling howl, from which many knees buckled, and without hesitating another second it lunged into attack. The werewolf, moving with incredible, almost unimaginable speed and agility for its enormous size, immediately targeted the group of warriors where their leader was. Strong Hand stood there, still firmly gripping his spear. Stone Fist, the strongest and most powerful of all the tribe's surviving warriors, with a loud battle cry that held more fury and desperation than fear, unhesitatingly threw himself in its path. Thrusting forward his heavy, long spear with its massive flint point, he managed to land one, but very strong, blow on the monster, plunging the sharp spear deep into its side, beneath the ribs. But the werewolf, merely letting out a deafening roar of sudden pain and rage, with one lightning-fast, crushing swipe of its monstrous clawed paw, flung Stone Fist aside like a light broken doll. A horrific, sickening crunch of breaking bones was heard, and the warrior's body collapsed lifelessly to the ground. The death of Stone Fist, so swift, sudden, and brutal, for one long, terrible moment, literally froze the other warriors with horror, paralyzing their will. But Swiftear's loud, desperate cry, for Stone Fist, for our fallen brothers, for the quiet water people, to battle, don't let it recover, snapped them out of this deadly stupor and forced them back into the fray. Recovering from the initial soul-chilling shock caused by the instant and brutal demise of Stone Fist, the surviving warriors of the quiet water people, with the fury of desperation, unleashed a veritable storm of sharp arrows upon the gigantic werewolf. Many of these arrows, prudently prepared by swift deer, were fiery, with small tufts of resin-soaked tow ignited from the nearest bonfires. Several such fiery messengers accurately reached their target, embedding themselves in the monster's thick, matted fur and immediately setting it ablaze. The werewolf let out a deafening roar, full of unbearable pain and insane rage which echoed throughout the canyon. It began to thrash wildly about the small platform, as if berserk, trying to beat out the flames with its enormous clawed paws and desperately rolling on the cold, snow-dusted stone. The large, brightly and hotly burning bonfires, prudently kindled around the entire perimeter of the platform, not only well illuminated the tragic scene of this unequal battle, but also effectively restricted the giant beast's maneuvers, while also severely blinding its eyes, accustomed to the gloom of the deep canyon and the darkness of night. This factor gave the people an advantage. Swift Deer, who in the heat of this desperate struggle had instinctively become the unspoken but universally acknowledged leader of the defense, shouted short, clear commands in a low but authoritative voice, skillfully directing the actions of his few but brave warriors. He constantly moved around the platform, trying by his example to inspire the others and simultaneously drive the werewolf, thrashing in pain and rage into the farthest corner of the platform, where the high cliffs formed a particularly narrow passage, almost a dead end. The remaining warriors, using large boulders scattered across the platform and natural rock ledges as cover, acted with surprising coordination and selflessness like a single organism. Some continuously shot from their bows, aiming at the most vulnerable spots on the monster's body, while others quickly prepared new arrows, drawing them from quivers and igniting the combustible wrappings, and still others maintained the bright flames of torches and bonfires, tossing dry branches into them. One of the youngest and most agile warriors, risking his life, managed to scramble onto a low but steep rock ledge, and from there began to forcefully hurl heavy stones down onto the werewolf's head and back, trying thereby to knock the beast off its feet, stun it, or disorient it for a time. Wise Owl, the old shaman of the tribe, stood slightly aside from the thick of this deadly battle, but within clear sight and hearing, so that his actions would inspire the warriors and affect the enemy. He did not cease his mysterious ritual actions for a second. He monotonously, but with great force, beat his old sacred drum covered with bison hide, and its low, deep, vibrating sound indeed caused the werewolf physical suffering. The beast would sometimes freeze momentarily, then begin to shake its enormous head furiously, as if trying to rid itself of an invisible, tormenting obsession. From time to time, the shaman threw pinches of crushed dry herbs with a very strong, pungent odor into the nearest fire, and the thick, acrid smoke from them immediately billowed on gusts of wind directly at the werewolf, causing it to cough painfully, sneeze, and furiously rub its red glowing eyes. Furthermore, Wise Owl, loudly, in a chanting voice, almost shouting the words, recited ancient, powerful incantations in the nearly forgotten language of his distant ancestors, passionately calling upon the spirits of the earth to bind the monster's movements, to make its legs heavy, and the spirits of the air to blind it, deprive it of sight, or cloud its mind. Despite all the desperate efforts and self-sacrifice of the Quiet Water People's warriors, the werewolf remained an embodiment of primal, untamable fury and possessed truly incredible, almost supernatural resilience. Again and again, with a roar, it broke through the sparse curtain of arrows and spears, its terrible claws and enormous sharp fangs mercilessly finding new victims among the defenders. Two more brave warriors, fighting to their last breath, fell to the ground, struck down by its lethal blows. One of them, an older but very experienced hunter named Crooked Arrow, seeing the pain-maddened werewolf charge with a furious snarl directly at Chief Stronghand, who by this point was already seriously wounded in the arm and struggled to hold his heavy spear, bleeding profusely, without a second's hesitation, shielded his chief with his own body and took the horrific, fatal blow upon himself, saving his leader's life at the cost of his own. Stronghand, his face contorted by unbearable physical pain and insane rage at the sight of his loyal comrade's death, overcoming his weakness, continued to fight desperately alongside his son Swift Deer, fully understanding that they had nowhere left to retreat, that this was their final battle. At a particularly tense moment in this bloody battle, when the werewolf, having sustained numerous serious wounds and severe burns all over its body, paused for a brief moment, breathing heavily and bleeding, to catch its breath before a new lunge. Swift Deer, who had not taken his attentive gaze off it, noticed a very important detail. He saw that the monster instinctively, almost imperceptibly, covered a specific small spot on its broad chest, slightly below the base of its neck, with its left forepaw. In this spot, its fur was thinner than on the rest of its body, and through it, An old, already healed but still ugly deep scar was clearly visible. Undoubtedly the mark of that very first arrow with the silver tip, which Swift Deer had loosed several days ago. And at that very same moment the old shaman Wise Owl, as if receiving a sudden enlightenment from above or hearing a hint from the spirits, pointed his bony finger piercingly at this very spot on the werewolf's chest, and loudly, drowning out the noise of battle, shouted to Swift Deer, "There, my son, shoot there. Its dark soul, its life force is hidden there, beneath that scar." Understanding from the shaman's words precisely where the most vulnerable spot of this practically invulnerable monster lay, Swift Deer instantly made a desperate, almost suicidal decision. He loudly shouted to the few warriors still on their feet to try to distract the werewolf's attention, creating the appearance of a massive attack from the left flank, using their last remaining fire arrows and loud, furious battle cries, while the wounded but still incredibly dangerous beast instinctively turned towards this noise and the gleam of fire. Swift Deer, seizing the heavy, long spear that had been additionally consecrated by Wise Owl before the battle. It was the very spear left by the fallen stone fist, but with a point into which a small piece of precious silver had been carefully embedded, began to quickly prepare for his final, decisive blow. Singing River, who had been watching his every move with bated breath, and had somehow understood his dangerous plan without hesitation, ran up to him and thrust a brightly burning torch she was holding into his free hand, crying out in a voice trembling with emotion, "Take it. Blind it first." Swift Deer, firmly gripping the spear in one hand and the flaming torch in the other, waited for that elusive moment when the werewolf, distracted by the feigned attack, for a fraction of a second completely exposed its vulnerable spot beneath the scar on its chest. With a furious cry, full of primal strength, in which all his pain, all his hatred for this monster, and all his boundless love for his perishing people merged, he first forcefully threw the burning torch into the beast's face, momentarily blinding it and forcing it to recoil, and then, gathering all his remaining strength, all his will into one last crushing lunge, he delivered a precise and powerful spear thrust. The heavy point, consecrated by silver and the shaman's prayers, guided by a firm, unwavering hand full of righteous anger, whistled through the air and plunged true to its mark, sinking deep into the monster's body. A heart-rending, inhuman, almost mechanical howl erupted, gradually fading into a long, gurgling death rattle. The werewolf's enormous, muscular body shuddered violently several times in horrific convulsions. It took a few more uncertain, staggering steps forward, as if disbelieving what had happened. And then, with a deafening crash that shook the earth, it collapsed heavily onto the cold stones, raising a cloud of snowy dust and fine debris. For a few moments, absolute dead silence reigned, broken only by the quiet crackling of the dying bonfires, and the heavy, ragged, almost groaning breath of the few warriors still alive. The body of the vanquished werewolf began to twitch strangely. Thick, black, acrid smoke with a repulsive odor billowed profusely from its numerous wounds and its maw, and it rapidly shrank in size, losing its distinct bestial features and gradually transforming into something shapeless, grotesquely human-like, before finally stilling and becoming motionless. The air filled with a strange, sharp scent, very similar to the smell of ozone after a strong summer thunderstorm, and the thick, nauseating odor of spilled blood and singed fur. Exhausted to the very limits of their physical and spiritual strength, covered from head to toe in congealed blood, their own and the monsters'. The few surviving warriors of the Quiet Water People stood motionless over the enormous, lifeless body of the vanquished werewolf. The oppressive silence that had fallen after the monster's deafening, furious roar, the clang of weapons and the death cries, seemed almost deafening, utterly unnatural in this place that had so recently been an arena of brutal battle. Swift Deer, feeling his legs buckle from weakness and the strain of all he had endured, slowly, as if in a dream, sank to one knee, his heavy spear clattering from his weakened hand onto the stones. He cast a heavy gaze around the platform, strewn with the bodies of his brothers fallen in battle, the mighty stone fist, the wise crooked arrow, the brave young warrior's turtle shell and flying squirrel. The list of losses was too long, too bitter. Victory, so long awaited, had come at a truly terrible, irreparable price. From the deep crevice in the rock where the women and children had hidden all this time, first came a timid, barely audible child's whimper, and then, convinced that the danger had passed, they began to slowly, very cautiously emerge. Their faces were pale and contorted by the fear they had experienced, by deep grief for their losses, and by a dawning, still uncomprehended, timid hope that the nightmare had finally ended. Singing River, paying no heed to any residual danger or the horrific sight of the vanquished monster, rushed with a desperate cry to Swift Deer, fell to her knees before him, and began to hastily, with trembling hands, examine his numerous battle wounds. Before leaving this terrible place, saturated with blood and death, which would forever remain in their memory as a symbol of their greatest trial, the remnants of the Quiet Water People decided to pay their last, sorrowful respects to their fallen heroes, to those who had given their lives for the salvation of the rest. The bodies of the slain warriors were carefully, with the utmost respect, laid upon an improvised bed of fresh fir branches, their faces, according to ancient custom, turned eastward towards the rising sun, symbolizing the beginning of a new path in the land of eternal hunting. Wise Owl, himself barely able to stand from fatigue and spiritual exhaustion, overcoming his own pain, conducted a brief but very solemn farewell ceremony over them. In a low, trembling voice, he asked the Great Spirit and the spirits of their ancestors to receive the souls of these valiant warriors into their bright abodes, where there is no more pain, no suffering, no fear. After this, the body of the dead werewolf, still exuding a faint cadaverous odor, was thoroughly surrounded on all sides with dry branches, remnants of resinous torches, and all combustible material that could be gathered. It was set ablaze. The enormous funeral pyre roared and raged for most of the night, consuming the monster's remains in its purifying flames, and the thick, black, foul-smelling smoke from it rose in a tall column into the night sky, carrying away all the defilement, all the dark energy of this place. Wise Owl also slowly circled the entire platform where the battle had taken place, carefully fumigating it with the acrid smoke of smoldering sage and juniper, to finally cleanse the earth of the blood spilled here, of the traces of evil and dark energy left by the werewolf. With the very first gentle rays of a new dawn, which shyly painted the hoary peaks of the surrounding cliffs, a delicate pink, then golden, symbolizing the victory of light over darkness, the exhausted but unbroken remnants of the quiet water people began their slow, arduous exodus from this cursed, ominous canyon of winter winds. Those wounded in the final battle, including Chief Stronghand, who was severely weakened by blood loss, were carefully carried on improvised stretchers made of sturdy poles and stretched deer skins. Each step on the uneven, stony path was taken with immense effort, their strength at its limit. But the sight of the wide valley, bathed in bright morning sunlight, which unexpectedly opened before them beyond the last turn of the gorge, gave them new, almost forgotten strength, and filled their hearts with a timid hope for a better future. It was like a long-awaited emergence from an endless, dark, cold night full of horrors into the bright, warm light of a new, peaceful day. After several days of very difficult but no longer so dangerous and fear-filled travel, they finally reached the shores of Blue Lake, their traditional, long-known wintering grounds. It was a spacious valley, well protected from the piercing winter winds by high hills, and covered with a dense pine forest that promised them not only reliable shelter and warmth for their hearths, but also the necessary building material for constructing winter wigwams. Fresh tracks of deer, elk, and hares on the newly fallen clean snow indicated that game was present, and therefore food. All of this, the silence, the peace, the abundance of firewood and game, seemed to them a true, uncreated paradise after the unspeakable nightmare they had endured in the gloomy depths of the canyon of winter winds. The people, despite extreme fatigue, deep grief for the fallen and still unhealed wounds, immediately, with a kind of feverish zeal, began to settle in the new place. They chose sites for wigwams, cleared snow, felled trees, built the first so desired hearths, and gathered firewood for the long winter ahead. However, the grim, chilling shadow of the canyon of winter winds would haunt them in troubled night dreams for a very long time, reminding them of the horrors they had endured. That same evening, when everyone had somewhat recovered from the long journey, sated their initial hunger and thirst, Wise Owl gathered the remnants of his greatly diminished people around a large communal fire, whose flames danced merrily, casting whimsical shadows on their faces. "My children," his voice was soft, but each of his words, filled with ancient wisdom, sounded distinct and penetrated deep into the hearts of his listeners. "We have passed through the valley of mortal shadows, and thanks to the courage of our warriors and the mercy of the Great Spirit, have managed to emerge into the light. That dark, ominous shadow, which pursued us so long and so cruelly, was not just another evil spirit born of our lands. No, it came to us from afar, from the east, from those lands already defiled and ravaged by the arrival of the pale-faced people. These new people mercilessly fell ancient forests where forest spirits have dwelt since time immemorial. They poison pure rivers with their refuse. They kill animals not for necessary sustenance as we do, but for empty amusement, for their pelts, or simply for sport. They rudely violate the great balance established by the Creator in this world. And from this terrible violation, from this disharmony, such monsters are born. Twisted, lost souls who have lost their true path, their form, like the one we had to fight so hard. It itself was once a victim, but unable to endure suffering, it turned into a merciless predator. It was a product of their cruel, greedy world, not ours, which is harmonious. Stronghand, the tribe's chief, gravely wounded in the last battle, and greatly weakened by blood loss and the trials endured, feeling his strength ebbing, solemnly transferred his authority and the symbols of chieftainship to his son, Swift Deer, before all the gathered people. "You have managed to lead our people through fire and water, through unimaginable trials, my son," he said in a weak but firm voice, placing his hand on Swift Deer's shoulder. "Your wisdom, your composure, and your selfless bravery have saved what remains of our people. Now you must lead us onward into this new, difficult time." Swift Deer, whose young face had become noticeably sterner and more resolute over these few weeks, and in whose gaze a special depth and wisdom had appeared, that which comes only after great upheavals, silently and with dignity accepted this heavy but honorable burden. He understood perfectly well that the battle with the werewolf, however terrible and bloody it had been, was only one, albeit very severe, trial on their path. Ahead, new, even more complex challenges undoubtedly awaited them, connected with the further arrival of the pale-faced people and the inevitable change of their entire familiar world and way of life. The Quiet Water people began their first, very difficult winter in a new, still unsettled place. They were significantly fewer than before. Many families mourned the dead. But the terrible trials they had endured together did not break them. On the contrary, they united them even more firmly, made them stronger in spirit, tempered their will. Deep scars on their bodies, and even deeper, unhealing wounds in their souls, would long remind them of the grim canyon of winter winds and the price they had paid for their survival. But they would also forever preserve in their memory the examples of the selfless courage of their fallen heroes, and the important knowledge that even the most terrible, most impenetrable darkness can be overcome if one remains true to oneself, one's people, and one's ancient traditions. Swift Deer, the new chief, often stood alone on the high bank of the frozen blue lake, gazing for long periods to the east, where, as he now knew for certain, vast lands already occupied or being settled by foreign, pale-faced people stretched. He understood with bitterness that their long, exhausting struggle for survival, for their native land, for their unique way of life, for the right to simply be themselves, was only just beginning. But now he also knew firmly, his people, tempered in the crucible of suffering, were ready to meet any new trials that the Great Spirit and this new, rapidly changing, cruel era would send them. Their hearts were now strong and unbending, like the finest steel that has passed through the purifying fire of great tribulations.